Okay, so we are on 1610, as I understand. Is that correct? Okay. So the translation reads, taking shelter of insatiable lust and absorbed in the conceit of pride and false prestige, the demoniac, thus illusioned, are always sworn to unclean work, attracted by the impermanent. So I say, and then you will please repeat. Taking shelter of insatiable lust,
taking shelter of insatiable lust,
and absorbed in the conceit of pride, and false prestige, the demoniac, thus illusioned, are always sworn to unclean work, attracted by the impermanent. So here's Prabhupada's purport. The demoniac mentality is described here. The demons have no satiation for their lust. They will go on increasing and increasing their insatiable desires for material enjoyment. Although they are always full of anxieties on account of accepting non-permanent things, they still continue to engage in such activities out of illusion. They have no knowledge and cannot tell that they are heading the wrong way. Accepting non-permanent things, such demonic people create their own God, create their own hymns, and chant accordingly. The result is that they become more and more attracted to two things: sex enjoyment and the accumulation of material wealth. The word ashuchi vrataha, unclean vows, is very significant in this connection. Such demoniac people are only attracted by wine, women, gambling, and meat eating. Those are their asuchi, unclean habits. Induced by pride and false prestige, they create some principles of religion which are not approved by Vedic injunctions. Although such demonic people are most abominable in the world, by artificial means, the world creates false honor for them. Although they are gliding toward hell, they consider themselves very much advanced. So the verse reads again, taking shelter of insatiable lust and absorbed in the conceit of pride and false prestige, the demoniac thus illusioned are always sworn to unclean work, attracted by the impermanent. So this chapter, chapter 16, is called Divine and Demoniac Natures. So this is a chapter that is about the white hats and the black hats. So we spent the first 5 verses of this chapter talking about the white hats, and now for the bulk of the rest of this chapter, Krishna's talking about what not to do and what the characteristics are of those who are of the wrong attitude. So we have something that we call free will, which means that we're not forced to act in a way that harms others or a way that's selfish. We're not forced to do it, but we can do it if we want. And we're not forced to act in a way that cleanses our heart and points us in direction of the Supreme Lord. But we can do it if we want to. So we're not forced either way. Free will is an interesting topic. I just ran across a video the other day about some long 4-year investigation done by the, what was it called? The, I can't remember the foundation now, that performed it in the University of Florida down in the, where is it, Pensacola, I think, or somewhere like that, somewhere. They did an investigation for 4 years, and they had a team of scientists, a team of philosophers, and a team of theology people, all working on the same issue. Big questions in free will. What is it? Do we really have it? Maybe some of you know that some years ago there was a researcher in neuroscience in California named Benjamin Libet, who performed a scientific experiment where he had, people wired up with these electrodes that were stuck on their heads or skulls, and it could measure the electrical activity that was going to the electrodes. And the subject was given a also, there were electrodes on their arms so they could tell when the motor impulses were being generated by the brain to make the muscles contract. So the subject was told to, at some random moment, to press a button. And at the same time, on a computer screen, they were watching a circle rotate around. And it was going in a perfect circle at a certain set speed very quickly. So they were supposed to remember where the dot was when they decided to press the button. And so they were measuring when the actual electrical impulses went to the hand. They were measuring also when the person said that they saw the dot. Did they see it at 12 o'clock or 1 o'clock, or did they see it at 6 o'clock or at 9 o'clock? So by knowing this, they could tell exactly at what time the person had randomly decided to press the button. And so after a number of these tests, what came out evidently was that when the people pressed the button, that there was they were also measuring the brain activity. So they could tell that there was a ramp up in the electrical activity before the person actually said they decided to press the button. And then, of course, there was the last thing to happen when the actual button was pressed by the electrical activity. So some people read this experiment to claim that if someone had been watching this experiment, they could have predicted just a few. They're measured in milliseconds, so we're talking about things like 250 milliseconds, which in normal talk is 1/4 of a second, or 500 milliseconds, which in normal talk is half a second. So people claim that they decided to press the button, but already there was electrical activity happening. So they read this to mean that the person had already decided before they decided. So already there was something getting ready to happen in the subconscious before the person consciously recognized they made the decision. And then, of course, the last thing to happen was the actual finger, the electrical impulse to the hand happened and the finger pressed the button. So many people use this as a flat proof positive that we don't have free will, because if we had free will, we wouldn't know beforehand that we were just about to make the press of the button. So this created quite a stir. But of course, most people reject the idea that we don't have free will, because our whole civilization would have to be rewired if we actually came to the real conclusion that in fact we don't have free will. Because it's free will that is exactly the center of what's being debated in courts, in the legal system, in the lawmaking system, in politics, and so many other things. Even in everyday social activity, we expect people to behave in a certain way, even, when we're not in some kind of formal setting, even on a subway or in a bus, we expect people to act in a certain kind of way. And if they don't act in a certain kind of way, we feel offended or angered or whatever it is. And so that assumes that people have the ability to act or refrain from acting, to act in one way or act in another way. And this we call free will. And it's surprising that when we start talking philosophically or scientifically or even theologically about free will, how wonderfully messy the conversation becomes very quickly. There are so many bizarre little aspects to it. So, I had always thought that, but it was surprising to see this whole video. It was put together by someone called, I think, Franklin Lawrence Kuhn or something like that. And it discusses the whole concept of free will. And there was the main leader, Al Maley, who was the leader of this Templeton Foundation, right, that was doing this research. And for 4 years, they had neuroscientists, they had sociologists, they had theologians, and they had other philosophers discussing this issue and talking about, what is free will? Is it tied to the idea of culpability, in the legal system? We want to know if someone did something that is criminal. And of course, if they were unable to help themselves from doing something, then we don't think it's criminal. But if they were able to refrain from doing it and they simply desired to do it, then it's criminal. And to decide these kind of issues, we have to A, accept the idea of free will, and B, we have to start asking questions on what it really means to act of one's own free will. So, of course, this chapter, Divine and Demonic Natures, starts to talk about this idea of how we use or misuse our free will. Now, most people accept the fact that we have free will. I won't get into the details of this whole discussion, although it is very interesting in so many ways. Maybe one day I'll do a whole thing on just free will, because it's a dazzlingly complex subject, and it has a huge history of philosophical attitudes and issues on it, from does determinism actually, is it true or is it false? And if it's true, can we still have free will? The compatibilists and the libertarian, there's all these weird philosophical terms that go along with it. But let us just suffice to say that free will means that we are not forced either to do what we usually consider a spiritually oriented or a oriented toward the supreme type of service thing, nor are we forced to do something that exactly ignores the supreme and ignores the feelings of others. We're not forced to do either thing. We at any moment in time can do either one. So what happens to those people then that decide to, on a regular basis, ignore the Supreme, ignore the order of the Supreme, and act in very selfish and self-aggrandizing ways? Now, what happens to those people, and what are they like? This chapter explores that possibility. So Krishna is describing, for the first 5 verses, describes what is the quality of what he calls divine or transcendental people. People who are focused on spiritual life. He describes that. And then after that, he says, all right, we've spent almost the entire Bhagavad-gita talking about that. So let's talk about the opposite side, because you can always tell, you can learn a lot by discussing one side and then the exact antithesis of that, or the opposite side. So here in the Divine and Demonic Natures, Krishna is describing some of these characteristics of people who are turning themselves away. Now, it's interesting that the verse that we, or you all, had decided to memorize for this week also talks about this whole same thing. There are 4 types of impious men, as we said, just a minute ago. There is the Mudha, the Naradhama, the Shurambhavam Ashritam, and the Maya Aparhitagyan. So these are the 4 types of impious people. And what are they? The Mudha is, to put it bluntly, the ass. The person who's just totally not very with anything, just totally absorbed in themselves, and doesn't have much knowledge or much care to get any kind of knowledge. And they generally work very hard just for peanuts, and they're satisfied with some small kind of material amenity like a iPhone or something like that. You just give them an iPhone and they're fine. It's interesting that in the many states that people will consider themselves not in poverty if they have a cell phone, a smartphone. that they may not have enough to eat, they may not have a car, but if they don't have a cell phone, that's the deciding factor. You can have a car, you can have enough to eat, but if you don't have a cell phone, you are not. It's just not right with the world. You are somehow deprived of fundamental human necessities. So this just shows how our society has mapped out things into a very strange kind of continuum. I was surprised to hear this, but we find certain things very important and other things not so important. So mudhas, or those who are asses, they don't think about anything as long as they have, whatever the next, sort of fix of sense gratification is coming down the pipeline. As long as that's headed their way and it's not delayed by any kind of inopportune event, everything's fine with the world. So the next step up from that is the Naradama. Now the Naradamas are people who have some financial wherewithal and maybe some intelligence, but they're not thinking about things very deeply. And whatever intelligence or wherewithal they have, they use it for their own selfish interests. And they try to arrange things so they make more and everybody else makes less. So that's the Naradama. And then we have the Maya Parhita Jnana, the person whose knowledge is stolen by illusion. Now, such people are philosophical, and such people make up whole new philosophies on how things are and how we should be. And these are just, kind of pulled out of the smoke and written on the wall. And they claim we should all bow down and do these kind of things. And where is their proof? They have none, but they're sure things aren't working now, so we have nothing to lose by following their particular prescriptions. So this is the Ashuram Bhavam Ashrita, those whose knowledge is stolen by illusion. And finally, we have the Ashuram Bhavam Ashritam, the ones who take shelter of the atheistic nature of demons, or the Maya Prityagyana, that's the ones whose knowledge is stolen by illusion. The Ashuram Bhavam Ashritam, those are the ones who have their knowledge. Those are the ones who are partaking of the atheistic nature of demons. Those are the people who are sure there's no God, and they're making sure that everybody else thinks the same way. They're very loud and, soapboxing the whole idea. And they have their various reasons, which they usually get from the Maya Parhita, those people who make up these philosophies. So these four kind of people are people who shun spiritual life. And because we have free will, we are not forced to be one of those kinds, or we're not forced to be the opposite of one of those kinds. Of course, in chapter 7, we have four kinds of people who do surrender to God. Those are four kinds of people who do not. So this idea of surrendering to the Supreme or rejecting the Supreme is right at the crux of free will. And the material world will never force you to do either one. You're free at any moment to choose either one. However, there's a catch. And that catch is that if you choose continually to reject the Supreme, you will become habituated to reject the Supreme. And therefore, it will come almost automatically after a while. And it'll be very hard to change that tendency to always reject the Supreme. So a person who acts selfishly and continues to act selfishly will become more and more increasingly selfish and more rejecting of any authority of any kind, and very self-absorbed more and more. Such a person will become more and more like that as time goes on, because they are habituating themselves to that. And that's what we call conditioned life. We are conditioning ourselves to a particular strategy, to a particular mode of behavior. And spiritual life, as opposed to material life, contrasts these two different kinds of modes of behavior. So when we decide to switch from the more materialistic, demoniac way of doing things to a spiritual way of doing things, we have to fight this conditioning that we have built up in ourselves for not just one lifetime, but even many, many, many lifetimes. So we've got a huge load of conditioning to overcome. But it can be done. And that's what Bhagavad-gita and the other Vedic literatures guarantee, that if we engage in the process of Krishna consciousness by degrees, we can swing from one to the other. So generally, in our modern thinking, when we talk about demons, we see, pictures of little red men with horns, and they are ready to stab us with pitchforks and this kind of thing. But this is not actually what we consider of demoniac. Demoniac is an attitude. Being demoniac is an attitude. And we ourselves, if we're honest, we see that we have that background ourselves, and we are just recovering from that way of doing things by trying to head in the direction of spiritual life. So I don't want to cover too much at one gulp here, so I'll pause and I'll ask if you all have any questions about that much that we've just covered about this whole idea of free will, about what we mean by demoniac and divine, about the attitudes, about these kind of overall concepts. Does anybody have anything? Yeah.
Thank you, Maharaj. I have a question about free will and criminality that I think
Right.
you mentioned, and because I had to deal with that a lot with my clients, so I was wondering if you can talk a little bit about that and the combination, I guess that intersection of that, and also the additional factor that what we, like one of, or most of my clients also suffered from some kind of a severe health issue, and most of the times it was something like schizophrenia or mania or
Right.
so how does free will and some kind of a condition of this sort, how do they interplay? And
That's a very good question. Actually, this video that I saw, you could probably Google it on YouTube. It's called something like Closer to Truth, Big Questions in Free Will. You can see that they're grappling with these issues, but they don't have any solid philosophical, substructure to deal with. But what happens, we talk about modes of goodness, passion, and ignorance. So goodness, in the mode of goodness, means that you are balanced. In the mode of goodness, you are not so much pushed around by the ambience or your past. You're able to look at things objectively, and you are not forced to or invested in or already committed to something. So you can say yes or no to things like that. But we give that away. As we move into the mode of passion, we become more pre-committed to things, and we become less able to say yes or no to them. And at the very bottom, we have the mode of ignorance, where you're partly broken, and at that point you are almost habituated to doing the wrong thing, and to such a degree that it's difficult to say that a person really, made a conscious choice. When an addict gets beyond a certain point, are they really choosing to buy yet another fix of heroin? It's practically, it would take an enormous act of will for them to resist it. So this is described in second chapter of Bhagavad-gita, the mechanism of addiction. We hear that dhyato vishayam pumsam sangasteshu pajayate sangat sanjayate kama kama krodo bijayate krodo bhavati samoha samohat smriti vribramaha smriti brahmshad buddhinasha buddhinasha pranashati. Contemplating objects of the senses, one develops attachment. From attachment, lust develops. From lust, anger arises. From anger, delusion arises. From delusion, bewilderment of memory. And when memory is bewildered, intelligence is lost and one falls down into the material pool. So what that is, if we were talking medical terminology, that's a pathology. That's how one thing goes from bad to worse. And at each step on the line, one is less able to exert any free will over something that is almost all-consuming. So at contemplating, we have a lot of free will at that stage. Contemplating, we can contemplate or not. But when we get to lust, already we've lost a little element of free will where it becomes more compulsive. That's why we're talking about lust instead of just contemplation. And then when we are lustily attached to something, if something interferes with our lusty connection, we are immediately angered by that. So someone who gets angry a lot, we can see that they are already predisposed to something, to the state where we're not just thinking about it, we're lustily connected to it, and we need to have it for some reason or another. And so this is a gradual losing of our free will by misusing it. And of course, when we go into the animal species, when a person lives a whole human life and has basically never exercised their ability or their determination to try to rise above that, to act other than to whatever possible enjoyment appears before them, to immediately embrace that, whatever the consequences might be. When one never acts against that, then one is gifted with an animal body in the next lifetime, and in an animal body, essentially that's what you do. Animals have no free will. They are totally pushed around by the material nature and the modes of nature. So when an animal is in rutting, time of their, year, they engage in sex life. When an animal is hungry, it eats. When an animal is, stalking its prey, it viciously rips apart the prey. And all these kind of things are just the way it is for an animal. It doesn't have any choice about the whole thing. It's the nature. And so if we do not act differently than animals, then we're gifted with a kind of body in a situation where we no longer have that kind of free will. Of course, by going through the karma of an animal lifetime, we're promoted gradually, step by step, and then we come back to the human. Now we have free will again. So as young people, we start out with this, good assortment, or good, we should say, proportion of free will. And then again, we can use it or squander it. If we squander it, eventually we go from the mode of goodness down into passion, and then finally into ignorance. And once again, we repeat the cycle. And that's why people generally tend to repeat the cycle of birth and death over and over and over and again, because they never act. Very much different than animals. Whenever an animal experiences any kind of possibility for contact with its senses, it knows automatically how to respond to that, and never thinks that maybe I should not respond in this way. So that's why when you're dealing with it, I'm sure from a legal point of view, you have these various levels. How much in the mode of passion or ignorance is the person? And that's why we as a devotional or spiritual educational community, are trying to educate people to understand these principles, because unless you exercise your free will, which is kind of like a muscle, if it's never exercised, it atrophies, so you have to keep exercising it in little ways, and eventually you become more and more in control of your life. And this means you're heading upward into the mode of goodness. Otherwise, if you don't become in control of your life, you're heading down into the mode of ignorance, which means your life is controlling you, not the other way around. You're not controlling your life. Does that make sense? Is that kind of what you were asking about, or was there another nuance that you wanted to explore?
No, I think you answered it. It's complicated, and I need to wrap my head around it. It just, like, legally, I can understand. Like,
right.
When you're defending a person, you're focusing on the mens rea. Like, did the person have the capacity, mental capacity to make this decision? But I wanted to understand it from a Vedic point of view.
So that's what we mean by whether a person has the, we all know that sometimes a person, when they're addicted to a particular drug, wants to stop, like smoking. A lot of people, it's strange that a human being can desire to smoke and desire to stop smoking at the same time. For most of us, we also have the desire to eat and to not eat so much. So those are two, oftentimes we find two conflicting desires at the same time in our consciousness. Which one wins? So the question of how that exactly works has to do with, overall, mercy from the Supreme Lord, how much we are in the mode of goodness, how much we are in the mode of passion and ignorance. So all these things will decide who wins and which desire wins when we have two opposing desires in the same individual. And so these same kind of things are there, and I'm sure in legal settings. Of course, I don't think the legal system has ever gotten that nuanced about it, but basically that's what's happening, that people are giving away their ability to make proper judgments by exercising wrong behavior. Now, the law has to step in at some point anyway, but even if a person's not quote-unquote in control of themselves, they need to be put in such a place where they're not hurting other people. So that's another aspect that the law has to deal with, that you wanted to say something. Oh. You're another legal side. Okay.
No, I was just thinking about, I'm thinking one of the things that Glikaria may be touching on is, when the legal system, even growing up, I never totally saw the justice in this, but the legal system, gives an out to the persons who commit the most heinous of crimes, but they have they have a strong mental deficiency, right? They can't control it. So then all of a sudden, okay, they go to the mental hospital, and then you hear they're let out so many years later, and then they do the same thing again. Like what? So, but I was just thinking, but the Vedic system, because you're saying in the Vedic system, basically the understanding is even those people who do seem in control when they commit a crime, the point is they're under control of material nature, but they willingly supplicate themselves to the modes of material nature. So I was just thinking, and please share with me what you're thinking. I'm thinking that the Vedic teachings don't really make this distinction between, someone, this person did really bad things, but he didn't know what he was doing, and someone else did really bad things, and he knew. There may be some subtle distinctions, but I think the Vedic teachings is either way. If you do something that's hurtful to other living entities, then the best way for that person to become remediated, to become better, is for the same thing to happen back to them. So for every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction, right? Karma. And in this way, that person learns, whether they were clinically insane or something like that or not. The karmic punch to let them see what they did to someone, that karmic strike has its effect even on the person who's very dull-witted. And so, do you agree? Do you agree with that?
Well, yeah, I think so. One of the problems is that now we're looking at a different picture. That divine justice is a whole other bag of worms. But basically, the whole system of justice is there from the Supreme Lord, and it's administered by the demigods. And the human political system is supposed to be a wing of that, is supposed to work in tandem with that. But we see that as we go further down, there's all kinds of, slip-ups and false positives and false negatives and all these kind of things. So that's where the problem is, that because our legal system or our justice system is not really in harmony, that sometimes people who are actually guilty get let go. Sometimes people who are actually innocent are punished. But then we have another tier, the demigods, who are actually understanding that a person who was culpable for something did not get their punishment through the legal system of humans that's set up, and they arrange for that punishment to happen in a different way. So there's that sort of normalizing tier above that. So if it doesn't happen here in the legal system of human beings, who are supposed to be the next level down from the demigods and their administration, then it will be handled by divine justice, So that's why, it works one way or the other. But if it's done properly in the human system, then a person kind of gets their karma in a very useful and immediate way, and it's all over with. When it comes through, the whole demigod system, then it may be more difficult in the long run. It may stretch out over a longer period of time. But either way, justice is going to be done. But if the people who are administering it, the kshatriyas in the material world, do it rightly, then they kind of make a very streamlined way of everything happening, and they make society better and more structured. But if they mishandle it, then they get karma for mishandling it. And the people who they falsely accused, or the people who they let go when they should have been punished, those people, then they get their karmic payback in some other way. So that's how I would address that issue. Yeah.
So, what about if, like, before Krishna consciousness life, you have specific tendencies to deal with certain emotional issues to make it better in a certain way, in a material way.
Mm-hmm.
And then you are in a spiritual life, but the tendency kind of there, it's not like always coming out, but all of a sudden one tendency came out, and then after that it's another and another, and then you notice that you start noticing things that you used to notice, which are causing just emotional pain.
Mm-hmm.
And it seems like you practice, you're doing everything, but all of a sudden, like, one thing leads to another, and you're like in that world.
Mm-hmm.
How to transfer back? You're not there. You're here, but
Mm-hmm.
the fine line seems to be so, like, it's really fine line. It's like you might be any minute in that world.
In which world? I'm trying to follow you. What's that?
In the material world. Like you are spiritual, you focus on Krishna, you remember about him. But then there are certain times that you start, it seems like you remember,
Right.
but you deal with the problems in a way that you deal before, like survival techniques all of a sudden on material world coming out.
Mm-hmm.
You like doing something that helped you when you were like just focusing on material life, not spiritual.
I'm not certain I understand your question, but
I think she means
What's that?
You fall off the wagon, you get the spiritual
Right.
thing going, and then there's a problem that comes in your life, and then you start dealing with it in a more materialistic way.
Right,
Forget
right.
it.
Okay, is that your question?
Not totally falling.
Right, but having your ups and downs,
Your
right?
tendencies. You just
Right,
notice that
right.
certain things might get you at some point.
Well, that's actually kind of the way it usually works in spiritual life, that we make progress. And to the degree we are able to follow the principles of spiritual life, to that degree we kind of have a graph where it kind of heads up like this. I usually call it, one of those histograms or whatever it is, where the bars are gradually rising one way. But sometimes, because of failure to follow important principles of spiritual life, or by making offenses, one can have a zigzag trajectory through spiritual life. Generally, I find that we talk about something called the 10 offenses right now. On Monday, we're doing this whole Harinam Chintamani class, and we're discussing the 10 offenses. And so these 10 offenses are the things that make Krishna turn off his, protection for us. As Krishna says in Bhagavad-gita, Daivihi Esha Gunamayi Mama Maya Dharatyaya, that this divine energy, meaning the material energy in this sense, is very difficult to overcome, but one who surrenders unto me can easily cross beyond it. So we make progress only because Krishna is removing the heavy force of the material energy. And so we're not doing it by our own strength, but to keep getting Krishna's mercy, from hour to hour, day to day, we have to avoid offenses. So when we don't avoid offenses, Krishna says, all right, we'll let you go back down in, And so usually I discover for my own self that when I'm starting to go backwards, I can usually trace it to some kind of the major offenses. There's 10 of them. The first one, of course, is to blaspheme devotees, dedicate their lives for propagating the holy name of the Lord. So that's probably the one that I make the most, So when we are negative toward those people who are struggling, also like us in spiritual life, then when we make offenses against them, then Krishna says, maybe you need to go back into the material world for a while, and see what it was like, So in this way, we, as many times Prabhupada would put it, we go out the back door of spiritual life, but then we come back again. So that's the main one. Of course, considering names of demigods to be equal to or independent of the name of Lord Vishnu, most of us probably don't do that one unless we come from an Indian background. Third one is disobey the orders of the spiritual master. Maybe we do that. Maybe we don't have a spiritual master yet. We're just trying to understand Prabhupada. Then we have, blaspheming Vedic literatures, considering the chanting of the holy name to be imaginary or making some concocted understanding of it, which is 6. Committing sins on the strength of chanting. Maybe we do that one a little bit, considering the chanting just like any other kind of ritual activity offered in the Vedas as religious, karma kanda, and instructing faithless people, or these are, the 10 offenses. So if we think about these 10 offenses and we try to avoid them, then generally we see that although there may be little ups and downs in the whole process of spiritual life, the general trajectory is kind of upward. But if we allow ourselves to get carried away by making one of these offenses, then the trajectory can have real steep ups and downs and backs and forths. So when we feel that, we can see that Krishna is removing the taste, Krishna is removing the protection, and there's a reason for that. So if we investigate our own consciousness and take inventory, we usually can trace it back to something that we are, some important thing we're slipping in, like we're not chanting our rounds anymore, you know. So when we cease to chant Hare Krishna every day, then that's removing a level of protection that we have. The material energy is everywhere. You know, so it comes in like a flood, and we're doused in it all day long. And as I've said before, it's said that in the heavenly planets, mostly we have the mode of goodness predominant. And in the hellish worlds, mostly is a mode of ignorance is predominant. In the earthly world, which is where we are, the mode of passion is predominant. And where can the mode of passion be more predominant than NYC? We are here, right, in the creme de la creme of the mode of passion. It doesn't get any more passionate than this, you know. So if we're going to deal with, you know, gale force passion, we're going to have a strong way of handling it. So that's why we take these precautionary measures of chanting the holy name and trying to avoid offenses. And then usually we find that we're going in a more or less steadily incline sort of trajectory, as opposed to a wilder trajectory. Yeah.
What happens to karma when Krishna removes the protection due to one of our offenses, or what you just described?
Well, the karma is also kind of a complex thing. When a person has not made any commitment to the Supreme Lord, then karma is pretty straightforward. You know, that at that point, it's like a check and balance system, or like a bank account. You do some things that are papa, which is sinful, and therefore you will suffer for them at some point later on. When you do pious things, then you will get some pious boon somewhere down the line as a result of that good karmic activity. Now, when you become a devotee, then you are, Krishna is playing with your karma. You know, I always like to say that when you become a devotee at that point, Krishna has your worker go home. You know, you're the person in charge of your karmic bank account go home, and he manages your bank account himself, and which means he can change it radically if he wants to. And usually Krishna does whatever it will take to try to make us more serious about spiritual life. So generally, because we have ourselves undertaken the remedial measure, so therefore Krishna gives a lot of credit for that, you know, so he wipes out a lot of that bad debt, you know. But on the other side of the coin, if after we have made the initial investment of spiritual life and we start getting laggy and lackadaisical, then Krishna may turn the heat up a little bit to get us more ready to take another step forward again in a serious manner. So he's not, and that technically is not karma, but it looks like it, and you know, it to us it feels the same way, but actually it's what we sometimes call Krishna karma. So the karma is there, but when a person makes a serious commitment to spiritual life, then Krishna manages your karma in a particular way to help you to engage and make progress. We see that when a person becomes initiated, they don't throw away their glasses, or their crutches go away, or their teeth suddenly become nicely orthodontic, or whatever it is. You know, they still have to deal with all that. And so Krishna allows some of your karma to stay. But, you know, a lot of the heavier stuff that was certainly on its way, you know, the UPS had already put it on their schedule, it won't make it to your door because Krishna will cancel the order, you know. But so in this way, we kind of get a special benefit there. So here we've been, yeah.
Okay, so Maharaj, so what about what's technically, you know, good karma? So some devotees, they experience bouts of good karma while they're a devotee.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So the devotee is thinking to himself, well, this is just my karma. Now, of course, we know that Krishna sort of takes control, by and large,
Mm-hmm.
of the devotee's life. But, on the one hand, I have full acknowledgement that that's how it works, and Krishna is directly intervening in our lives. And
Mm-hmm.
for some people, he gives a bunch of bad karma because and it seems connected to some things they're doing in the past, and we know when they get the bad karma, well, so that's it seems really bad, but if they weren't chanting Hare Krishna, it may have been like this. So
Right.
but we see how Krishna's so we can understand from that perspective, Krishna is still intervening, even though the devotee is getting this bout of bad karma. So then so then the question was, so what about the devotee who's getting, some good karma, but he's a devotee of Krishna? He's thinking, well, it's not that Krishna thinks I have special value relative to other devotees, but this is just a token, reward for my past karma.
Well, good karma is usually Janma Aishvarya Shruta Shri, so those are kind of your manifestations of good karma. Janma is good birth, Aishvarya is wealth and, some kind of facilities. Shruta is having good education or good intelligence, and Shri is physical beauty. So these things are manifestations of good karma. And if we have them, we know that we have got them to use them as a tool to serve Krishna. And this is the trap in the material world, that when people get good karma and they're not oriented devotionally, they will intuitively and almost without any kind of, a chance of doing otherwise, they will misuse the fruits of good karma. Because whatever we get coming our way, whatever kind of facility is coming our way on the good side, is then intended to be used in devotional life. And if we use it in some other way, then we will, be considered a thief. And that will actually rack up once again. If we're a devotee, then Krishna will let us know, probably in no uncertain terms, that sooner or later, if we're not making any remedial attitude shift, that we are headed in the wrong direction, and we'll get some blowback from that. But that's what all facilities that come our way. Sometimes the devotee, as a result of their past lives, may have a very opulent setting where they have lots of money. If they misuse that money in a way that's against pushing forward spiritual life, then they'll get a reaction for that. Good karma is almost just as dangerous as bad karma. But when we try to utilize whatever facility comes our way in a spiritual direction, then we won't experience that. And Krishna will give us more to one who is utilizing everything in his service. He will give more and more and more, because then that person will be able to utilize many things, different facilities, wealth, position, fame, all these things. They can utilize them directly in spiritual life, which is a positive thing if one knows how to do it. But one has to be very detached, and most of us are just not ready for that kind of detachment. And if somebody would suddenly give us immense wealth, fame, or any of these other desirable things of good karma, it would go to our head. So that's generally why devotees don't make so much. It doesn't appear that the fruits of good karma are exploding like fireworks in their lives. Okay, are there any other quick questions? I'll go on to the next segment, if not. So these are some of the qualities of those who reject the Supreme. Now, one of the things I like to point out is that we have two basic categories of rejecting the Supreme. One of them is to just be against God. You know, we can call that kind of very antagonistic atheism. And on the other side of the spectrum, we have people who are just sold out to sense gratification. In other words, we are convinced that happiness is material happiness. And to be happy, we need to do whatever it takes to make our senses pop, whatever it is that we have decided are our particular smorgasbord favorites. You know, each one of us has cultivated many lifetimes of making our whole, favorites list of what we think are our most important types of sense gratification. And if our lives really focus around that, then we will waste life and we will gradually go downhill. So why I bring those two things up is because you can, usually atheism and materialism go together. Like, horse and carriage, they are very, they tend to go together, but not necessarily. One can be one without the other. And similarly, we see that, being transcendental or being oriented towards spiritual activity, and also at the same time recognizing that material sense gratification is a trap, those two things go together. But again, they don't have to be together. There are people who are very positive to God, but also sold out to sense gratification, which is, one combination. The other combination are people who are very much against God, but also realize that sense gratification is useless. Now, there's not many in that category, but that also is possible. So, to make positive progress, one has to understand both things. That first, there is a Supreme Lord, and He's a person. And at the same time, we have to understand that giving our lives over to what feels good from moment to moment and using that as our main priority driving mechanism, is a waste of our lives. So that's why we learn these things. And of course, those who are demoniac basically are kind of against both of those things. If they believe in God, or if they've heard of God, they usually reject the idea of God, and they also deprecate God. So sometimes we see some brands of atheists, they spend their time railing against the concept of a supreme being, while other types of atheists actually believe in a supreme being, but just hate him. That's a different kind of atheist. So those are two different kinds. But generally such people will also be, as we hear here, be very eager to enjoy their senses, because if there is no God, or if we don't like the rules that God has made, then we're just going to ignore them, and instead, what do? And there's only one thing to do, and that is to try to enjoy your senses to the maximum extent. And usually, whenever we're talking about maximizing sense gratification, there are some things that are perennial, top 40 hits, in sense gratification. So out of sense gratification, what's usually number one with a bullet, Sex life, right? So that's number one, crowd pleaser, everybody's favorite, So we have that right at the top of the list. And then, drugs are also fun, right? So that's kind of down there. And number two, various kinds of intoxication. Those are big hits. And gambling's nice, and then we get into the darker things like murder and all those kind of things. So these things are things that people who have no sense or no desire for any kind of rules or regulations by anyone outside of their own mind, they find these kind of things attractive. And so to maximize these things, we can decide to go after them either in a somewhat civilized or restrained way, or we can just say, to hell with that, and let's just go after it. I don't care how we get them. So, of course, people who just go after these things big time without any kind of compunction, such people we find dangerous, because they're really not at all interested in how what makes them happy affects you. They're only interested in what makes them happy. Whereas others are more interested, well, I want to be happy. That's the goal of my life. And happiness comes from senses meeting sense objects. So to do that, I will do that. But if I see that my happiness is causing somebody else distress, I'm going to back off a little bit. So when we talk this way, sometimes I bring out a book that was written by Bhaktivinoda Thakur called the Tat Vivek. And in there he talks about these different categories. So he calls their spiritual life on one side of materialism is called Jadavad. Jada means stone, and Vad means truth or philosophy, the philosophy of the stone. So materialism is very popular. And materialism runs through even religions, So you can be religious and be materialistic. And for the most part, religions are like the Titanic half-sunken religious materialism, where we really are giving some lip service to God, but for the most part, we really are trying to get on God's good side so he will bestow material blessings on us. And instead of thinking we should serve God and, if he wants to do something for us, fine, but that's not our purpose in serving God. So materialism is a big hit, and he divides materialism in two categories. One of them he calls Jada Nirvanavad, and the other one he calls Jadanandavad. So materialism that's Jada Nirvanavad is people who have realized that material sense gratification doesn't work really. So they are going to enjoy themselves by giving up everything, voidists. Now, there are not many people in that category, so that's, way 0.000 something percent. But the other kind, Jadanandavad, those are people who think that matter is where it's at, and that's what I'm going to get, that's what I'm going to work for every day, every night. And there are two categories of those, and one of them is Svarta Jadanandavads and Nirsvarta Jadanandavads. So the Svarta Jadanandavads are those people who, I'm going to be happy, I do not care what happens to you. Those are people who are dedicated to their own material happiness, and they don't give any kind of care about what anybody else comes out as a result of it. Now, the other kind, Nirsvarta Jadanandavad, are those who have some compunction. They want to enjoy material life, but they feel funny when what they enjoy causes some distress to others. So they're a kind of lighter category. And even some of those may be religious people. But still, it's Jadanandavad. It's still materialism, basically. So when we learn about spiritual life, we learn we have to not only give up materialism and try to rewire ourselves to gradually put Krishna first, put the Supreme Lord first. And we also have to learn that Krishna is a person, and we need to serve him. And in that kind of way, we begin to realize that there's somewhere we're going. We're not going to become some kind of void or go into some place where there's only clouds and you can't really touch anything. You don't need to eat anything and all this kind of stuff. We are going to a spiritual world where things are tangible just like they are here, but where we're engaged in service to the Supreme. So both of these things have to be there. We have to develop a favorable attitude toward God, not an antagonistic or a disbelieving attitude toward God. At the same time, we have to develop an understanding that just giving in to whatever the senses seem to want is a quagmire. Now I'm going to stop again here and ask for questions. That's the second part of my explanation here, because we're talking about divine and demoniac natures. So the divine natures accept this idea of structured rehabilitation of our consciousness to be redirected to God and directed away from sense gratification. And demoniac people are the opposite. They feel there's no need to change anything that they're doing, and they are sold out to usually material enjoyment in whatever crude way actually they like, and that's how they're different. So questions about any of that?
So, without naming any, there are certain faiths that promote material gain.
Right, right.
And we know what they are, we don't have to mention them, but they're all religions and faiths that they want you to come to temples.
Well, all of them do that,
Pretty much somewhere.
including the Vedas. But we have to understand that that's second-class religion.
And that's funny you mentioned about the Vedas, because I read a little bit about that, where it does mention, the earlier ones, the materialism aspect.
Yeah, somehow or other, we discover that as the age of Kali Yuga comes in, that knowledge becomes more and more fuzzed out. That's the whole nature of Kali Yuga. That some 3,000 years ago, when Kali Yuga began to make its appearance, that the Vedic teachings were more or less misconstrued. And we went from the idea that the Supreme Lord and getting away from sense gratification and getting into service was the real purpose of the Vedas. We started to get toward something that more resembled that by doing certain rituals, one gets the material favor of the Supreme and therefore lives a comfortable life and possibly goes to the heavenly planets. Then we have the advent of the more modern religions where actually going to heaven becomes the target of religion. And so what happens in heaven? In heaven, generally, a person has all their material desires somehow or another met, kind of like you've got HBO there and there's somebody that comes with a, morning bell saying, what do you want for this, for breakfast and this and that and the other. And this is a kind of sort of fuzzy conception that we have. And this concept of heaven is directly coming from the Vedic concept of what we call the heavenly planets. But in the Vedas, the heavenly planets are not the target of spiritual life. The target's beyond the material world, which you have to go beyond the heavenly planets. And beyond them is the actual abode of the Lord, the spiritual world, where to go there, one has to be ready to serve the Supreme Lord 24/7. If you don't want to do that, you wouldn't be happy there. That's why you're here. And if you really are not sure you want to do that, you probably stay here, and good luck. This place has its downside. And so, that's the point, that we have to gradually work our way to that feeling that's actually natural of wanting to serve the Supreme at all times. But we have chosen the wrong thing so many times that now that appears to be natural, although it's a conditioned response. And so even in the Vedas, this conception of doing good pious work so that we enjoy in the material world and maybe we can get elevated to the heavenly planets is there too. So we are trying to move beyond that conception And many of the other religions don't have a good philosophical hold on that issue. However, that does not mean that people in other religions, there aren't some who have punched through to a deeper level. I think generally there are. And I've come across people like that. So there are people who have recognized that, but they're not the general people. And there's not a good philosophical structure for getting there. That's the problem, you know. Whereas in the Vaishnav understanding, we have a process of how to get there, and it's clearly spelled out. This is where we're going, not there, and not over here, and not somewhere else. So that's how I would respond. Other questions or comments? Good. Either I'm explaining things well, or you are so confused that that you have not even a clue of what I'm talking about. Yes.
So you've mentioned like being influenced by like the material modes of nature, but it also seems quite dangerous to become content in the mode of goodness.
Right.
But is it solely just the practice of serving that helps us to transcend?
Yeah, right. That's the whole thing. Bhakti is nothing more than an attitude, but it's it's actually our original and completely unartificial attitude. It's the attitude that, as Prabhupada puts it, is our constitutional attitude. That's the way we are. But we have this false, perverted attitude that we have practiced for so many lifetimes that the false, perverted attitude comes naturally for us at this point. But the service attitude is endemic or natural to us. But to get back to it, we perform what's called bhakti yoga, or the devotional process. And it's done under rules and regulations. So at the end of this chapter, chapter 16, we'll learn, so the first 5 verses of this chapter talk about what people who are divine, how they act. And from about 6 to 20, Krishna discusses what it is that people are like when they are going the wrong direction, the demoniac attitude. And then from 21 to 24, those last verses, Krishna kind of talks about how one does that. You know, how do you actually do that? And then we learn that that's by reading scripture and trying to align your life with it. So just like when we're trying to learn something difficult, say for instance you're trying to learn music, so you read some theory about it, you read some practice techniques, and then you try them, and at first you're stumbling and it sounds clumsy and so on and so forth, but eventually if you stay with it, it becomes natural. And it's the same way here. So we call this process where we're working under rules and regulations Vaidhi Bhakti. And it's a process of bhakti under regulations. We don't have any big feeling for God. Maybe sometimes we catch a little whiff of it here and there. But, you know, generally speaking, we know that mostly we're in rehab, you know, and we're kind of trying to get in the right direction, and we're doing the things that it says. But in time, that grows. And in time, we start to genuinely feel open towards the Supreme. And we actually, I mean, it's happened to me. It's kind of surprising, you know, that over years that you start losing your focus on things that one time consumed your life, you know, things that at one time seemed to be really, really important and sort of mainstream. You discover that you walk down streets and you look at stores and think, why do people go in there? You know? You begin to see that a lot of stuff that is there in the material world is, you know, what would I do with anything like that, you know? So at any rate, you discover that you begin to manifest these qualities that we're reading about. So it's actually a real process. It really does work. But at the first, we're doing it under rules and regulations. We're doing things that maybe don't come so comfortable or easy for us. And we're not doing things that we really would like to do, but know that we'd probably be better off leaving alone. So at first, there's a lot of that. And as time goes on, it becomes less so. And we become more and more genuinely focused. And that means that we're rising in the modes. That's what it means to rise in the modes. And when you're actually in the mode of goodness, you see things that could be an opportunity for some kind of gross sense gratification, and you just think, okay, I'm not interested. It's not, you don't fight a big battle inside. Sometimes you do fight a big battle inside, but you don't always feel that. So that means that you are gradually rising up in the modes and you are becoming liberated from the material world. So that's there. That's how I would describe it. Other questions, comments? Okay, so yeah. So thank you all very much for your kind attention. All glories to Srimad Bhagavad-gita. All glories to the Vaishnava devotees of the Lord.